right, we'll call this work session to order. Our colleague Libby Garvey will be out momentarily. Thank you everyone for being on time, and happy Friday to you all. We're going to begin turning it over to Mr. Manager Mark Schwartz for the presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to introduce the Sultan of Salt, Mr. Greg Emanuel.
Sultan of Salt. I was looking forward to that moment. Good morning, Chair Dorsey, members of the board. I want to introduce a couple people on my team because it's really a team effort in DES. I'm backed by a very capable team, versatile, a lot of depth. Mike Moon, my deputy. We have service area chiefs, is kind of how we talk about it. We have Dennis Lees for transportation. George May is out sick today, but John Murphy is covering for him. Demetra McBride for Office of Sustainability and Environmental Management. Mike Collins is out at a conference. He's our operations service area chief. I'd like to introduce Janelle Okori. Janelle was recently hired as going to be his assistant in the operations area. So we have a lot of depth, and it helps a lot. We also have so those are kind of the operational areas. And on the support side, we also have a strong team. We stole Tyler Smith from DMF, and she joined us this past year. And Jessica works our communications along with a strong team. Catherine McCarty, I'm not sure if she's here. She's our admin services chief. And Nate for decision support. Nate has really crossed the bridge between a lot of our operational areas and technology, really operationalizing things for us. But that's just some of the folks in the room. The real work is out there in the field with the maintenance technicians, the trades workers, the equipment technicians, the plant operators, the construction managers, project managers who get all the work done every day. So our agenda today in DES is pretty broad, a lot of different funds. Intend to do a quick overview of all the funds and then go into the general fund and then propose a break at that point. And then we'll cover utilities, stormwater, the Boston Garage funds, and the print fund and auto fund. So the DES vision and mission continues to guide our department, near-term and long-term decisions while we operate and sustain our infrastructure and the environment. It's all about creating a community that is vibrant, accessible, resilient, and sustainable. So how well we do that, our performance, really forms a significant part, we believe, of the county's reputation and our ability to attract and retain the right businesses and residents. Here's a snapshot of our broad and vital services to the community. I'll just touch on a few highlights. This past year, we filled more than 2,600 potholes. We added more protected bike lanes in the county, now totaling 3.88 miles. Along with that comes the increasing demand for their sweeping and snow removal within those bike lanes, which requires a specific equipment also. This slide also demonstrates our success in sustainability. We've got a recycling rate of 49%. And of course, we are the first community to be designated LEED Platinum. And a real shout out to Joan Kelch and the AIR team there, Jessica Aberlin and her team, who really worked that hard over many years to achieve that. And of course, we've got the ongoing commitment to converting our streetlights to LED. Our capital bike share stations now total 92. We'll probably have 9 more be delivered by the end of the year. And finally, we're committed to maintaining our utility infrastructure. These numbers demonstrate our ongoing investment in constructing, replacing, and inspecting water, sanitary, and storm. Here are a few department stats portrayed with additional detail. Upper left there, the water breaks, if you look over the last 3 years, are increasing slightly. Granted, they're greatly influenced by severe cold snaps, but we need to keep a focus on that and make sure that we're adjusting the appropriate investment levels if appropriate. Our streetlight response team on the upper right, we've had continued success on minor repairs after the board approved additional funding in FY18. However, if you look carefully, our major repair response times increased in FY19. That was driven by unsatisfactory contractor performance, and we're working hard to turn that around. On a side note, we're also continuing to work long-term outages with Dominion, as you know, as they have their challenges, but we're making some progress there as well. Speaking of streetlights, many in the community are eager to see the streetlight management plan. Sometime this month, I'll be sending to the manager the streetlight management plan for signature. And that will reflect the extensive community involvement we've had over the past couple of years and consensus on things like the lighting temperature and the fixture design. It'll lay out a comprehensive approach to our streetlights over time for both the county-owned lights and the Dominion lights and where we might trade things. Paving on the lower left. With continued steady investment, both bond and PAYGO, the paving condition index of 75.3 finally reached into that desired range of 75 to 80. So we'll need to continue to invest. Every year, as you know, has its own unique challenges with paving. Over the last year, we had a really high water table, and that's kind of manifesting itself in new and different potholes this year. And of course, the cost of materials keeps increasing in the paving realm. On the lower right there, we have the customer service office. If you look at the calls, we continue to see growth in customer demand, both on the phone and via public stuff. So we've had a recent consolidation of our customer call center with the former utility service office, and we expect to see an increase in inbound calls and a decrease in our call abandon rate, which is something we hate to do to customers. More detail in the utilities section later. So before I get into the specific changes of each fund, I want to give you a high-level picture of all the funds we're going to talk about today across DES. Bottom line, we have proposed reductions across all of our major funds, including Stormwater and the Utilities Fund, and overall we kept growth to just under 1%. That's pretty significant when you consider that salaries, which form 40% of our budget, are increasing between 3.25% and 3.5%, and contractual increases are also included in those numbers. So how do we do that? Well, when the manager tasked us with reduction in the fall, we were already underway. We started this process last summer. We felt it was really important this year because we knew it was coming to dig deep into all of our programs, not just the general fund, to look for efficiencies and smart realignments. So we'll hit all the DES funds today except for PAYGO, TCF, and TIF, which will be covered during the capital work session in early April. For the FY20 DES proposed general fund budget, expenditures go down by 1% for a total proposed budget of just over $98 million. Revenue decreased by 5%, and our staff will have a net reduction of 3 people. Our budget reductions focus first on efficiencies and internal realignments, but they also include some service impacts. In the FY19 budget process last year, our reduction strategy was very different. There we focused on shifting expenses to other funds like TCF and Stormwater to take the pressure off the general fund. And you may also remember last year we adopted significant revenue adjustments with the parking meter revenue. And as I predicted last year, that could not be repeated. So different strategy this year. So here are 2 significant changes in our budget. We're proposing 2 additional positions from the general fund for land disturbing activity permit review. We're proposing just over a $10 decrease in the household solid waste rate. And the manager rolled that out the first day as one of the items where things are actually going down. So that will drop to $306 annually, and that's driven by a number of budget reductions and efficiencies. We'll have more detail on that later. But first, before I go on to the next slide, I want to talk about what's not on this slide. And this is in response to earlier board discussions, and Ms. Crystal, you mentioned on Tuesday in the CPHD work session. I'd like to note what is not here. At this time, the budget does not include any additional positions or resources in DES for increased development activities as a result of Amazon. And as you know, our transportation team in particular, but along with some people in the utilities and stormwater area, works in a very integrated manner with our colleagues in CPHD. So we're expecting our team will also see some increased workload, and we may need eventually some funding from that $1 million contingent that's been allocated. It would go to specific areas that we're concerned about. Design engineering for transportation engineering and operations. This related to the design of signals, curb space management, parking, and the management of traffic plans necessary through the many phases of construction. Site plan coordination that works hand in hand with the planning staff when we're developing the details of the project and the conditions. And then transportation capital project management of the many projects that are related to Amazon in both Crystal City and Pentagon City. The latter of that could, of course, be funded from TCF or TIF. So back to the specifics. To help address a growing backlog, particularly in the single-family home realm, we're proposing 2 additional reviewers to better meet timeliness expectations of our customers for LDA permit review. The bottom line is this: our customers want their LDA permit approval about the same time they receive their building permit approval. And based on recent data set we analyzed, LDA reviews are averaging about 16 weeks from application to approval, compared to building permits at 10 to 11 weeks. So there's a pretty significant lag on average. In other words, we're typically the last permit and holding up the project. And so if we were adding these 2 additional resources in a vacuum, we would likely reduce that gap between the 2 reviews by about 50%. However, there are other variables at play, as you know from the stormwater work session we had in the fall. On one hand, we're looking at policy changes that may simplify reviews. For example, we're now reviewing the results of our pilot program that offered the simplified method, and we don't have results for you yet, but we're underway with that. On the other hand, we have also heard loud and clear from affected neighbors that we need to put additional analysis and find better ways to prevent runoff damage to those downhill properties, and such multi-parcel analysis will likely complicate and possibly lengthen our review cycles. So it's kind of hard to predict the outcome of this. It's a step in the right direction, though, and we'll continue to watch it and keep you informed. I would also, to manage expectations, I would note that the effects will not be immediate. It takes about 6 months to recruit, onboard, and train engineers to achieve the high-level competency for this complex body of work. The household solid waste rate will decrease just over $10 per household, driven by the combined effects of various cost drivers shown here. And board members were recently briefed on the merits of removing glass from the recycling stream. And following the concepts of the EPA's waste hierarchy, that's how we'll do that. Our next steps include finalizing our own messaging and communications for our residential customers so to facilitate their understanding and the right behavioral changes. We'll look creatively for opportunities also for additional drop-off locations. Minor point on the household solid waste rate. We advertised a rate of up to $306 per household because we have some additional operating and maintenance variables cost risk. There's a potential project to reduce certain emissions at the Covanta plant, the waste energy plant down in Alexandria. And that rate, the rate may decrease actually a bit farther for adoption related to that effort, but we won't know for a couple weeks. So at the time of adoption, you might see the numbers go around a little bit. We're proposing eliminating 7 pieces of equipment from the Solid Waste Bureau's emergency fleet, which is currently underutilized. Although things like the rear loaders are occasionally used for other services, like special events, community cleanups, Christmas tree collections, the vehicles are not used with sufficient frequency to justify keeping them in the inventory. It's more cost effective to lease them when needed. So we'll take on a little additional risk there if there's a big hurricane type scenario, but we believe that's a manageable risk. And then on a brief note, this cut affects both the general fund and household solid waste rate. The $35,000 cut here is shown in the general fund. Okay, we're proposing eliminating a vacant environmental planner position in the Solid Waste Bureau that oversees a variety of environmental programs. This position has been vacant since October, and with great staff that we have, we've been able to manage a program with acceptable impacts. However, over long term, though, this position worked a lot in the commercial space, and so that may impact our responsiveness for our commercial customers. The next cut is a vacant building maintenance shift supervisor position that's responsible for overseeing the B shift building engineers. The B shift runs from 1 p.m. to 8:30 p.m. This will impact the other 3 maintenance supervisors who will now be on call every 3rd week instead of every 4th. And there will also be no direct supervision of our maintenance guys that are out there during this shift, which also includes weekends. So that then in turn may impact customer responsiveness during those times, whether it's a community center or a library, depending on how much is going on at other facilities. The next budget cut is actually a great news. It's saving money, and that's all possible with the county's continued investment in converting county-owned streetlights from high-pressure sodium to LED. We've made a lot of progress in this area. We're about 85% complete with our inventory, and we estimate $18,000 in ongoing savings this year. Consistent with our prior years of cutting low productivity routes, and then based on low ridership, we are proposing to eliminate the ART 53 midday route and the rush hour extension to Westover, which is seeing 7.4 and 3 riders per hour respectively. The reduction will significantly impact neighborhoods in the northernmost part of the county, as shown in the route diagram here. They'll lose all midday bus service. We're also proposing to eliminate weekend service on our ART Route 43, which serves Crystal City, Roslyn, and on here to Courthouse. And while that's a very successful route on the weekdays, we're only seeing 4 riders per hour on the weekends. This is a newer route that was added at the beginning of FY17. So it was funded by the TCF, not the general fund. So although this is a general fund briefing, we thought it made sense to talk about the ART cuts all at once. The TCF briefing isn't for a while. And of course, on this proposed reduction, the alternate service on the weekend is available via Blue, Orange, and Silver Metro. Lastly, we're proposing 2 reductions that I would classify more as budget realignments to a more appropriate location. The first proposed is the Utility Undergrounding Program Coordinator to the Utility Fund. Utility undergrounding is moving stuff off of overhead poles underground. And since we're seeing not much action in that area, the responsibilities of this position have been refocused on the underground and the surface public infrastructure, the review of the site civil engineering plans that include the water mains, the storm, the sanitary, and the curb gutter sidewalk, dry utilities. The demand for action and study and review is there, in that realm is very high. We're also proposing partial capitalization of a space planner position. These are the people that work the fixtures, furnishing equipment, the furniture for all of our projects. This position will begin charging 50% of their time to capital projects based on the current projects in the pipeline shown here. As we move into key budget considerations, we thought it might be appropriate to focus briefly on the dynamics and drivers of our important local transit service, ART. The board members are pretty much aware of these dynamics, but just for the benefit of the audience who might view it. The ART operations and maintenance contract is at a renewal point. The RFP will be out next week, but the timing is such that we won't know negotiated cost until after budget adoption. So this might come back again to the board depending on the results of the negotiation at closeout. We're facing a number of complex ridership challenges, which in turn, of course, affect cost recovery. So as you can see on the chart on the lower left, it shows the latter 6 months of the year for the last 3 years. And ridership has declined consistently over those last 2 years, driven by several headwind factors. So the blue line is the most current, the green was a year ago, the orange is 2 years ago. So here are the headwind factors. The regional challenge of return to riders to rail post-SafeTrack. And then, of course, through the next phases of SafeTrack. Many of our riders use ART to connect to rail. Increased transportation options like Uber and Lyft, the effects of that which are really difficult to quantify. Telework, of course. And then finally, challenges with contractor and service quality and meeting pullout. We think we've recently made some real progress with our current provider, and FY20, of course, will be a rebuilding year when we award a new contract. On a more positive note, other trends in the department are encouraging. Through an effective safety program, top-to-bottom involvement, and the right moment-by-moment decision-making of our workers in the field where the risk is greatest, we've made some enormous progress. Just yesterday morning, our DS safety manager, another part of the support team, shared the 2018 stats. And as you can see here, we reached new lows, which is getting us to our goal of 0. The trend that you see here matches other safety complements of lower incidence rates, injury rates, everything. It's all moving in the right direction. So we've had the lowest level of total lost workdays over many, many years. And of course, this not only helps budget and productivity, but more importantly, the lives of our employees and their families, because lost time and injuries affect more than the job. Looking more broadly at our budget challenges, both historically and looking ahead, I'd like to point out several dynamics that we're facing, particularly in the strong economy. So in last year's budget brief, I mentioned the challenge of retaining skilled technicians, given long commutes and so forth. This past year, we started to see some different dynamics where we lost a number of skilled white-collar professionals, project managers, contracts people, and then we recently lost a high-level trades worker. Typically, the scenario is they're taking jobs closer to where they live, often with local governments or even VDOT in communities outside the Beltway. So naturally, we support the managers' continued focus on compensation and HR's efforts on job studies and career ladders. And finally, with the board's support over many years, we are now poised with great operational opportunities at Buck, Virginia Hospital Center, 26 Old Dominion, to develop our core services efficiently for both public safety and public works type of items. So we'll need your continued support as we move through the planning, land use, and zoning issues associated with phased project implementation to actually secure those operational improvements. And of course, in the meantime, we'll still be working collaboratively to meet the dynamic short and long-term needs of space-free APS. And finally, we too support the Amazon-induced redevelopment. It's a question of our speed, level of service, and keeping up with the expectations. Chair Dorsey, at your discretion, we can
Thank you.
break here.
That's wonderful. It's a great time for a break, and we'd like to invite to the front our advisory commissioners to give some comment on the budget. We have from the Environment and Energy Conservation Commission, Vice Chair John Bloom, and also from the Neighborhood Conservation Advisory Committee, Rob Swenis. So if the two of you would like to come up to the front, we've got these 2 chairs reserved expressly for your use, and we'd love to hear comment on parts of the DES budget that overlap with your commission's purview. And there's no real merit way to do this. Rob, your seat hit the seat first, so how about we turn it over to you?
No, that's fine. Thank you very much. It'll be a very short comment. The Neighborhood Conservation Program normally through the PAYGO process gets around $500,000 for staff. My understanding is the recommendation has been to eliminate one position where actually the occupant is going to be retiring in a few months. Our only suggestion in that regard is rather than eliminating the position, we would ask that it be frozen. And the cost difference is the same, but as all of you are aware, we're undergoing a soon-to-be, for sometimes long soon-to-be, but anyway, we have confidence, a reexamination of the whole neighborhood conservation program as a whole, and a reevaluation of all kinds of things regarding it. But when we have gone through that, we fully anticipate we will be going back to having a robustly funded NC program, at which point we're going to need that position. I understand from our staff people that the current staff members, when this person retires, are capable of handling the work, and they will be fully employed. If we were not to get these issues resolved with the NC program, then in a couple of years, yes, there would be a downturn in the amount of staff needed, but we are very optimistic that we won't reach that point, and that's why we'd like to see this position frozen and not filled at this time as opposed to totally eliminated.
Thank you very much, Rob. Appreciate it. It's an interesting suggestion that I'm sure we'll ask about a little bit more. Are you ready, John?
Sure.
Thank you.
Am I on here?
The light's on, you're good.
If the green light's on. Okay. So good morning, everyone. My name is John Bloom, and I serve as Vice Chair of E2C2 and Chair of the Energy Committee under E2C2. I'd like to address two significant issues. First up is our strong opposition to the proposal within the budget to end the successful and incredibly appropriate dedication of the residential utility tax revenue to the AIR program. AIR has cut the county's greenhouse gas emissions substantially, brought the county positive national attention, and saved taxpayers far more in energy costs than it has cost in revenue. The residential utility tax, or RUT, has been central to its success from day one. The stable funding it provides has allowed strong staff hiring, well-run programs, and excellent results. Equally important is that the public gets the connection between the small tax on utility-supplied fossil fuels and the programs to reduce the harms that fossil fuels cause. And I'd just like to add that the science on climate change is clearer every day, and AIR is at the center of the county's response to what is an existential threat to future life, not to mention future budgets. So the proposed budget would abandon this successful funding approach that every board for the past, more than a decade has supported, and would do so just as we're asking much more of the AIR program. The newly revised 2019 version of the CEP, which is still under internal consideration, will no doubt raise the bar in every area and add major new work around the transition to clean energy in buildings and transportation. So our ask, which we realize is significant, is to restore the RUT as a dedicated funding source for the AIR program and CEP implementation. Restoring the RUT and keeping the RUT tax rate the same would provide AIR with a substantial bump in its budget, which we also support and think is appropriate. We recommend working with staff to develop bold plans to move the county forward on clean energy and clean transportation. And certainly I have some ideas in mind of ways that the new revenue could be spent, but I would totally blow my 3 minutes.
I think it would be okay just to give us a couple of illustrative examples
I
of
can
what
give you a
might
couple,
suggest.
and I'll also say these are, staff are your real experts, and their insight and ideas is, really where the action needs to be. I would, urgent areas from my point of view include county leadership in developing large contracts for renewable energy supplies. I know there's discussion underway, but this is an area where the county could not only offset and purchase renewable energy to offset its own electricity or to supply its own electricity, but lead within the community, other major entities, bring them along in doing that. There's a huge amount of work that needs to be done in electrifying the county's many vehicle fleets and encouraging the same in the community, and in encouraging deep energy retrofits of not only the county's buildings, but even more importantly, commercial and residential sectors. Another example would be supporting and perhaps even standing up nonprofits that can deliver expert advice and communications services to help the community make this transition, because there's a huge amount of work and communication that needs to go on, and I think there's more they could do and probably learn from the Transportation Department and in working with nonprofits in that area. So those are my thoughts, but like I say, staff are the real experts here. So we know that our request is not as simple as it sounds. It's a serious ask, and it requires working out a fair funding deal with APS and balancing out the general fund where these funds would come from, and that will take work. But we think the challenges are not insurmountable, and the payoff for Arlington of keeping this dedicated funding source would be enormous. So that's our main ask. And then the other one is more of a concern and a question, I guess. E2C2 is in favor of funding the residential food waste recycling program and couldn't find it anywhere in the budget. We thought that was going to roll out this year, and so, we're concerned, we're hopeful that something's going on, that food waste recycling program can be included and rolled out this year as expected, and that's, like I said, that's more of a question and concern. So that's it. I really appreciate your time and consideration, and obviously we'll stay engaged through the process and happy to answer questions, discuss these issues anytime.
Thank you. Why don't we take this as an opportunity to maybe get at some questions and themes that have been raised from the discussion or the presentation thus far and the comments from Rob and John. Ms. Crystal?
Great. I wanted to start actually with John's comments. Thank you for delivering them on behalf of E2C2, and I think these are others we've heard within the community. I do appreciate both the ideas you've proposed and also the recognition you raised that to rededicate the residential utility tax exclusively to air would have not only the excellent effect of significantly bumping up air's budget, but the significant impacts elsewhere. That said, I noted in your comments you raised a theme that we talked about quite a bit last year, which was the extensiveness of our energy consumption reduction and efficiencies and renewable projects spread throughout the organization. And in fact, we gave the manager direction last year to develop as part of the CEP update during calendar 18 a regular reporting template that would measure the full breadth of related efforts across our sustainability program areas, including all of those funded by the RUT as well as other funding sources, and the resulting outcomes so that we could track ongoing progress. And I know when we accepted the decoupling last year, it was with the understanding that we would continue to monitor this really closely and to be able to have these conversations with our community. So we needed not focus so much on the RUT as the levels of how much we were investing, but could look more comprehensively. So all of which is to say, and I see some conversation already, if you could let us know the status of that.
And if Demetra McBride come up and help me out with this one a little bit too. I'll take an initial shot at, and Demetra will probably be able to embellish. Certainly understanding the board's guidance from last year, the challenge, I think, for us has been how do we do this as a practical matter? Because at the time in the discussion that we had with E2C2, I remember the discussion well, that kind of the idea was that we're trying to move into these other sectors, whether it's APS with their energy stuff, affordable housing with their things. So although those investments are happening in those areas, obviously, with the work that they do, what becomes difficult is to track the actual energy component of that, because these things are not broken out and bid separately. They're not, costed both ways, because the good news is both of those sectors are doing the right things. They're following the policies that we encourage. We have a draft policy. Joan Kelch and I were just discussing with Shannon the other day how we have a draft policy going on that we've been working on with APS, and they're already starting to follow the principles of our draft policy. So all the behavioral things are there, and people are making the right decisions, but actually to quantify becomes like an untrackable thing, and the amount of staff effort becomes really difficult. We can model it, but I think there'll be quite a bit of difficulty in giving you confidence in those numbers. I don't know, Demetra, if you want to add anything. We had this conversation literally at lunchtime yesterday.
Yes, we are, and I will take full responsibility for delivery of that matrix being late. As Greg noted, you have a number of different agencies, both within and outside of the county government. Not everybody is tracking the same metrics. They're not measuring, they're not doing it on the same time schedule. So there's a real kind of digestion of all of this information. We're working very closely with AIR. We're happy to have with us, on our staff, an analytics expert. So we are working with him and with GTS, with Nate, to try and work out a BI format that is going to be kind of the analytics end, and then there's going to be more of a public consumption end that is going to come out in draft. We're probably going to have something available by April just to look at internally. That's going to be more of a pictorial, graphs, pie charts, just kind of measuring improvement. So it's a visual tool, and then there's going to be the more analytics tool that we're working with GTS. So I wish that everybody had been measuring the same metrics with the same methodologies and algorithms, but taking that as a kind of metrics and data soup and trying to really responsibly interpret it has taken longer than we anticipated, so I apologize for that.
This is a quick follow-up. So by BI, you mean business intelligence?
Yes.
Have we thought about, in addition to the analytical framework, we can use, the case study method to really, look at some specific areas so that we can develop some estimates broadly so that we may not necessarily choose to be able to track analytically to the dollar, knowing how complex that is among different organizations and different methodologies. But if we can pinpoint a couple of illustrative case studies to really get a sense and revise them over time, I think it can give us some at least informed data as a way to kind of move forward without exact specificity.
If I could just follow up before, I really appreciate the candor and the substance of what you've just suggested. It's not a surprise to me, and it's great to know that we have good minds working on that outcome. Short of having the outcomes data in time for this budget decision-making, one thing, frankly, that would be helpful to me is to just know the inputs of spending. I know the concern has been among advocates for this issue in our community and among board members is that delinking the residential utility tax meant a backing off of spending money on sustainability efforts in our community. And so ultimately, what matters most is what outcomes we're getting. But if there's some insight that you can provide to us across these partnerships about the level of investment this county has continued to make since the decoupling in fiscal 19, that would give me a lot of confidence or information in thinking about proceeding with that decoupling in fiscal 20, to know that we're not disinvesting. It's just that the money is being invested in a more embedded departmental way. Is that possible, even recognizing the outcomes work is more challenging?
I think that we can certainly do that, and we can incorporate that into the materials that we've developed for 2x2s. The other thing, without making it too dense, is that you always walk into challenges. Like, for example, there was a certain amount of the funding that was redirected to affordable housing. Affordable housing is limited by their developers and what their developers can do. So these kind of externalities are kind of embedded, but what it means is that AIR has been working with affordable housing, so we're looking at other funding mechanisms like PACE and possibly looking at the state's SB 966. So, again, we don't want to take up too much of your time with the 2x2s. We've already had one, and we probably are, I'm adding ad hoc to the prior discussion that we've already had, but we want you to know that we're staffed, particularly internally, where we have a lot of consolidation and strong collaboration, is that we don't say, oh, this isn't going to work. We say, okay, this direct route A isn't going to work. Let's start developing the B and C plans. So there's a lot of determination and commitment and collaboration going on there. So we'll be sure to, if not go through that exhaustively, to indicate where that's happening.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Garvey?
Yeah, thank you. I'll just tag on here just a little bit and say, don't worry too much about the 2x2s. I mean, this is a very large department that touches everybody. And actually, when we hear about it touching people, it's usually don't take it badly in a bad way because things aren't working. And so to that, there are a whole bunch I got a lot of stars here, so I'll just ask one, to ask you to talk a little bit, and Demetra, while you're here, it's probably good. The idea that we're going to start analyzing houses that are kind of quote-unquote downstream when we start issuing permits, that's really huge. And if you would talk about that a little bit and maybe put in too, I caught the bit about rising water table making potholes different, and I think it gets into the whole issue of climate change and how that's affecting our community and what you do. So if you'd like to expound on that just a little bit, just for my edification and folks listening.
Do you take a shot? Go for it.
Okay. There's going to be, as usual, there's going to be a very, very specific in terms of operations approach towards that. And then I want to remind that we're moving forward in the risk assessment. And the risk assessment is going to take our data and what is happening currently that we know, and it's going to match it with future projections and methodologies for adjusting and, really adapting for that. So I think that you're going to get a very rigorous and potent and effective, set of facts and data and strategies to work from as soon as that's done, so.
Probably will have a cost associated with them. Are you working, I assume every jurisdiction in our region is dealing with this? I was just wondering how much kind of cooperation, because I'm assuming everybody's kind of struggling with it, and that you're probably somewhat working together?
We're working together, both in terms of just partnerships, direct partnerships. Also, the regional commission is doing something, and we've been talking to the COG with the Army Corps. Our impression for sea level rise is very limited, but it's very significant. So it's 4 Mile Run, which is the entry point. But unfortunately, we have a very significant key facility there with the wastewater treatment plant. So that is incorporated into our risk assessment. I want to just add on to what you said, a cost is going to be. The risk assessment is also going to assess vulnerabilities, and it's going to do that risk assessment in kind of magnitudes of scale. So what we can do is work with all of our partners and with the board and with the administration to really direct that funding where it makes the most sense, where your risks and costs are fairly parallel, and where things might not make financial sense, there's always going to be backup strategies.
That's great. I look forward to that, and I will say, sea level rise, while I'm concerned, to some way, it's simple for us because it's that one water treatment plant. I'm a little more worried about this rain, that it looks like we're into a new normal, a whole lot more rain, and that affects the entire county and is stressing all of our systems, and I'm guessing that's probably going to be a bigger deal for us.
Actually, your key vulnerability.
Yeah, that's what I was guessing. Yeah, kind of feels like it. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. DeFerranti?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I want to appreciate your line of questioning, Mr. Chair, and also Ms. Crystal's regarding the driving things we need to do to address climate change. And John, your quick list of the things that we can do to address it. I have been trying to get up to speed with, as you know, meetings both on the AIR program, but also on the budget of implications of the RUT. Let me just test Mr. Emanuel or Mr. Manager. I think we're in the neighborhood of, if rededication would mean, depending on how you catalog, would mean somewhere in the order of 2 to 3 million in budget implications. Is that ballpark right? Or is it more or less?
I don't know off the top of my head. I don't know if Emily or Richard could maybe answer that. We'll dig a little bit for that. Maybe we can get you the answer today. If not, we'll get it to you in a follow-up.
Yeah, because we
You don't have to this second. I just would love to have that. I need to have that number like in the top of my mind. Yes.
We'll need to get you some more detailed responses on that. But one thing which is important to talk about, when the residential utility tax in fiscal 19, when the board adopted, when the board said it was okay to decouple it, we raised the rate.
Yes.
And the amount of revenue coming in went up. Okay, so the actual amount of residential utility tax that was going to energy programs, I don't think it was, it was affected, but not to the scope of the $2 or $3 million people are talking about. The tax increase was dedicated towards affordable housing and other items. So for me, the conversation is how much are we spending on the environment, and has that level increased? And so in the fiscal 20 proposed budget, we are proposing more spending than what the board adopted in fiscal 19. Is that enough? That's certainly a question for you all to consider.
Sure. I really appreciate you we had a little discussion when I did just a meeting with Mr. Stevenson, and so that's helpful, and that was the first start as I try to get up to speed here. And so I'll want to follow up just on that little budget question. Another question related to the AIR program that just helped me sync up. There's in the budget notes, there's a decrease for the CEP consultant, but in the broader item, there was an increase in budgeted allocation for consultants on the AIR program. That's still there. It's just not so much described in the DES, at least the web page that I've seen. Is that right?
part of the challenge is, like, there's so many programs in the department relative to the format of the budget book. It's very integrated. So we added $125,000 to PAYGO, which is a later presentation, specifically for energy efficiency projects, so it doesn't show up in today's briefing. So that's part of the complexity of it. So that's some of the additional resources.
Sure, that's great.
Manager's referring to.
So as we work to resolution on this, the schools, schools we have our revenue sharing agreement, the schools have that percentage. They are doing, they're doing a lot of work on roofs for schools. And so I can envision sort of a refocusing of the RUT that acknowledges the work that the schools are doing in the revenue sharing component. And at least that would be of interest to me. And then the last point I'd make on this line of thinking, and I'd love to learn more from colleagues, is on transportation, we have a fairly accepted view that induced demand is a relevant consideration. And I guess I would, by analogy, be interested in the threat that climate change poses, and that would be part of my argument towards additional resources and at least consideration of rededication of RUT. So I just wanted to share that with you. And then the only other thing I would say is to a little bit align myself with Ms. Garvey on the, and I know I did not watch this work session last year, but on stormwater, there's an open question in my mind whether additional resources could be helpful in that area because of the land disturbance, and we've seen this again and again in our communities. So if there's a way to follow up on that, Mr. Emanuel, just that question as to whether there might be a need for that one additional resource there, I'd love that afterwards.
All right, we'll give you time to think about that.
I wanted to add that we have been having conversations. They asked for a little bit with schools to get their category or inventory of energy spending. Leslie Peterson was a little busy getting their budget out, but both Leslie and John are working on it, understanding that that's been a request from, our board. So we'll get that back to you.
Thank you. Mr. Gutschall.
I'm going to try to be very quick. Thank you, Mr. Chair, to just add my thoughts to this topic, which is, and there's a couple questions embedded here. And first question, though, is, Mr. Manager, I'm looking on Web 483, the financial summary of the AIR program, and I see a net decline of 6% in total expenditure. So I didn't quite understand your statement that we're actually spending more, or you're proposing more in FY20 as compared to FY19 adopted. What I would like to add for consideration is the point about whether or not, how do we figure out what fits in this bucket and how the differences in how people, and that conversation, Ms. Cowan, your response about schools that even just trying to get, if we kept these funds earmarked specifically towards sustainability, we would essentially see that schools and everybody else would come sort of and apply for it, would want to get to those funds. And then we could have criteria, and there wouldn't be any question. It wouldn't be about trying to, after the fact, say, oh yeah, this is a sustainability. Well, I think, Ms. Crystal, it's absolutely fair and it's right, and I think we do. We'd be wise to want to know what are we spending on sustainability. I would encourage us to continue to try to push towards, if you have these funds earmarked, then programs would have to qualify for them. Those programs, then we can judge on an annual basis. We can look at, are we getting good bang for the buck? Are we doing the right things? But then we would know what we are spending, at least some amount, on sustainability. The other aspect that I wanted to touch on, it's slipped my mind.
Don't worry, we'll have more time.
Manager's response to your first question, though.
That just when Mark was saying that, it's because he added funds in PAYGO for energy efficiency projects, a combination of ongoing and one-time. So when we look at energy, it's not just at the AIR program.
So that actually,
across.
Yes, I get it now.
Yeah,
so that's not reflected on the financial summary, but
you're right. On every little project page it isn't, so I hear you, but we can get you a full-blown summary. That's the intent of this.
But my other comment, real quick, Mr. Chair, is that what we are further doing, so even if costs, if expenditures to the AIR program, if the AIR program is not being cut, what we are doing that is sort of the next step in this decoupling that I am not in favor of, is we are transferring everything this year in FY20 proposed to net tax support. So we are we are actually fully completing the decoupling. And given that the RUT is a regressive tax, if we really want to say as a board and we want to decide, you know what, there's no point in having this link, we don't see that there's a connection between a tax on energy and investments in energy efficiency, then I would argue that we should just do away with the RUT tax that is regressive, and we should just take the commensurate amount and add it back to the real estate tax. If we're going to do net tax support, let's do net tax support and not have a regressive tax component.
Thank you, Mr. Gutschall. I will just, to this conversation before we move on to other questions, I think this is a bigger policy question that we, the five of us, probably need to work through to a greater degree. It's not just dedication to the RUT. It is the idea that I think somewhat management is trying to solve is coming up with dedicated or earmarked funds that are in search of things to be spent on versus building a program, a sustainability program that you think will intentionality produce good goals toward climate change. There's lots of different ways that we can think about constructing it, and I think we've got 5 people who are eager to engage in that, so we're going to have a good spring. All right, another line of questioning. All right, why don't we start this time, Mr. Gutschall, since you've got it, we'll start with you, and then work our way down.
I wanted to ask a couple questions about art. Actually, one main question, and the question is actually top of mind because just last night I was at the Barcroft Civic Association, and there was quite a bit of discussion about transportation and art service, and in particular bus service along the Pike, and where are we going. And I know we've had extended conversations, and the slide you had the slide, I think it's slide 17 maybe, actually a very nice graph that's sort of describing what the issues are that we are facing. My question, though, as we're looking at where we're going and how we try to sort of rebuild the program, because for several years we had growing ridership, and now we've had sinking ridership, and I am really worried that when do we bottom out and when do we start growing again? Because when we're talking about cutting routes, it's hard for me to sit here and in a budget conversation advocate for that. Well, we shouldn't eliminate a route that only has 3 riders per hour. That's not, we can't justify that. I get that. But when we ask why do we only have 3 riders per hour, and how are we going to get to the point of where we're not cutting routes and adding routes, one question that I have as part of that conversation is, where does price elasticity fit in here? Because you talked about other options, and you talked about Uber and Lyft, and the most common thing that I hear is, well, why would I pay, if it's $3 or $4 or $5 a trip to get from point A to point B between for bus fares? Why would I pay that if for $1 or $2 more I have door-to-door service, I'm not waiting for anybody, and et cetera? So where's price elasticity fit into the model here and what's happening with ridership?
Art's $2.
Yeah, actually, I want to just, for the benefit of the board, take a step back to the larger transportation picture. Art isn't sitting out there in isolation with some of these declines. I'm just going to, for the board's refreshment, Metro Rail in Arlington is off about 20 to 25% from its 2010 peak. Metrobus is off more than 30%. Art is off 12%. Capital Bike Share, 9%. Taxi cabs, off. Pretty much everything other than micro-mobility and TNCs and walking are off. And I know that we are working really hard to figure out the dynamics of what is a very disruptive period in transportation. I believe very firmly that we have to work with other transit providers, certainly working with Metro. We have to step up our game, provide higher quality service, more reliable service with better information. Art is a very cost-effective way of getting around. It is far cheaper than the TNCs. What we're up against is the app, when you just hit the button and a vehicle appears. It costs more money, and there is actually a cost that's borne in the public right-of-way in terms of use of our travel lanes, blocking bike lanes, crosswalks, bus stops. The environment is complex. I will assure you that we are doing everything possible to make transit an attractive means for our residents to get around. But a lot of it is convenience. People like the convenience of having on-demand service.
Mr. Leach, I take from that answer then that there's no sense that price has anything to do with it?
Like I said, I think there's a complex set of factors that are at work here. I think from our standpoint, doing everything we can to step up reliability and convenience and providing really good, easily accessible information and better communicating that our transit options are affordable options. If you go to the ART website, it doesn't highlight that this trip will only cost you $2, or if you make a transfer, you can actually do that transfer for free. So I think this disruptive environment that we're in means that we have to step up the game to make sure that our transit options are not only viable, but very attractive to our residents and workers.
Well, I appreciate very much that I know that great minds are thinking very hard about how to reverse that trend. The slide that you had, I actually thought that was really informative. Do we have up on our website or available an infographic about what are we doing? In other words, when I had this question last night, and if this exists, I apologize for not being aware of it, but do we have something that we can give out to the public that we're sharing with folks to let people know what's happening and what are we doing to get going in the right direction?
We certainly can pull that together. There are a lot of activities underway led by Lynn Rivers and our Transit Bureau staff.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gutschall. Ms. Crystal?
Thank you. I really appreciate that line of questioning, Mr. Gutschall, and I think too, specifically with a lot of the neighborhoods on the Pike, there's the additional layer of the premium transit network that is coming, but is served as much by WMATA bus service as it is by ART. So there are a lot of questions to disentangle here, and I think it'll be, of course, at the discretion of the chair, but I know I'm optimistic that we're going to start seeing some of the construction of those super stops, et cetera, later in the year, hopefully consistent with that original timeline. So it might be worth to do a briefing later in the year about whether the premium transit network, what improvements have already been done, et cetera, for those constituencies, my neighbors in Barcroft and others along the Pike who are concerned about seeing it. I wanted to ask a question specifically about the 43 cuts. If I recall, we looked to, or two questions actually. If I recall, we expanded that service because it was so popular during Safe Track. Is that right? So I wanted to ask, I know you all had given us some data in the budget briefing that Mr. Gutschall alluded to, that it's just not seeing the weekend ridership. And so I wanted to ask about what its weekday ridership looks like. But also we got a good question by email from an ART rider the other day, which was to say, knowing the Blue Line service disruptions that are coming this summer through Labor Day, which would be about a month after when the fiscal 20 budget would go into effect, do you anticipate, given the origins of this route's expansion in Safe Track, that there actually might be a little bit of a bump in ridership that would need to be served? And if so, are there options to delay the service cuts by about a month?
So just for time, if I could, I'll just answer the second part for Ms. River. So the airport, the blue yellow line shut down is south of the airport. So there is going to be service that continues from National Airport.
It's uninterrupted?
And
there are no impacts to service north of the
there's
shutdown?
going to be service changes, but trains will be running south of the airport. North of the airport.
Absolutely.
And then there's an entire regional collaboration to shift as many people onto local transit and other transportation options to accommodate that shutdown. That's the more efficient way to deal with those riders than running an inefficient service.
It's a great point.
So-
My question was, honestly, would delaying this of a month, these cuts of a month, help us participate in that regional effort. I know, as we've talked about in context of NVTC, the Virginia Railway Express, others, we would love to be able to say that we're going to meet all the service needs, but this is a major disruption. You're right, north, not nearly the same disruption as going south. Could this be a piece of the puzzle was my question. The answer might be not really, but.
So to answer your first question, the 43 weekday service is doing incredibly well. And of course, it was attributed to Safe Track, and people became used to it and rode it more. It started off just being peak hour service only, and we expanded it to all day and expanded to evening service. The biggest generator has been riders of VRE. And because they don't have weekend service, that's where we see that there's not as much ridership. As far as the shutdown that's going to happen this summer, potentially it could help. But right now we're looking at the fact that most of the transit is trying to get further into Arlington. They're trying to get to the Pentagon City. So that's where we're really going to see a lot of shuttles and services that are being worked on right now with our partner agencies.
Okay. Thank you. So your recommendation then would be not to delay the cuts by a month, but to continue to work on those other avenues for absorbing service impacts?
I think we need to look at all of it.
Okay.
And we won't know really until we get into the heart of what's going to happen. And then you're going to layer on the vacation and tourist season too. So we'll just have to see and play it by ear.
Let me just, before I yield the floor entirely on this question, do you all have flexibility from other funding sources if it turns out delaying the cuts to the 43 weekend service is a better option? I mean, I know DRPT, for example, had committed to funding like 80%.
80%, yeah.
So
I'd rather
if this doesn't go into, I mean, if this cut goes into effect with this budget, it doesn't tie your hands entirely about exploring that option or future options,
That is correct. And I would also mention that this particular cut does not affect the general fund budget. This weekend service is funded out of the Transportation Capital Fund.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Garvey.
Okay, I'm actually going to leave transportation after a quick, so I might ask if Mr. DeFerranti wants to stay on transportation, just so we don't go back and forth too much.
Sure, and I have a question on art. If you...
Yeah, so then let me do my quick transportation thing, and we'll come back to me later. And that's just, I would just like to also add, even if it doesn't seem to make sense with the numbers, throwing one more wrench into the wheel when we're changing all of those things with the, with the metro issue and the shutdown for a month, it really might make sense, as Ms. Crystal said, to just kind of delay it a month just because everybody's going to be dealing with so much change. And to find that, oh, we could do that, I remember that route, and then discover, well, that's down too, that just a thought. Okay, I yield.
So quickly on transportation, I think I've kind of telegraphed this. Through the budgets, I'm interested in whether there's some routes that might, whether there are cost efficiencies that could come through small buses as opposed to the larger. I didn't see, and this may be another work session, but I didn't see purchases of buses, either large or small, in this budget. But I'm curious if you have thoughts on that.
Actually, we are in the process of looking at our next bus purchase. They will be the larger buses. The cost of bus service is really in the labor. Whether it's a small bus or a large bus, it's not that much difference. There may be some minute differences as far as maintenance, but at the end of the day, it's going to be the labor that operates and maintains your service.
Great, that's very helpful. Appreciate your leadership, and maybe offline, if you're willing to share with me just a little of the economics of the purchases, that would help me. I'd really appreciate that. And that's all I have on, well, one more thought on transportation, which is I am very grateful to have seen the service hours resolved, Mr. Chair, and if you had anything to do with it, thank you. That was a tricky thing to work through. And last, I just want to acknowledge, Rob, as far as I'm concerned, I don't want to leave entirely. The freezing of the position is at least something that I'm open to. It doesn't, there's no budget impacts. I know you had a lot of discussion last year as a board, but that's something I'm open to.
Thank you, Mr. DeFerranti, and you're welcome. So on to Art, with the upcoming new contract and potentially a new service provider, given the precipitous declines that we've seen in this fiscal, which are an intensification of what have been the multi-year trends. Are there any sort of performance guarantees or safeguards that we're looking to do differently with the next art service contractor that can give the art ridership some comfort that we won't see the precipitous declines in reliability and service quality that we suffered through this year?
That's a very good question, Mr. Dorsey, and because we're on the precipice of it being a very active procurement, I have to be very careful about what I say, but what I can say is that we have looked thoroughly at addressing those issues and how we can manage the contract and hold a contractor accountable for disruptions to our service. So we put a lot of thought into this with the new contract.
Okay. I know you share this goal, but at one time when it was, measured in on-time performance, art was about the jewel of, the region in terms of transit. And, when you reach that highest standard, the declines that we've seen are certainly disappointing, but I think they have an even disproportionate impact on our riders who, used to just view art as exceptional. And even though it's still good, that's a pretty big gulf. And so we're hearing it. And I think, Mr. Gutschall, the concern that you earthed earlier, even though, price certainly matters for people who don't have it. Metro has done some studies into price and demand elasticities and found that actually transit is probably priced at about the right spot. And art doesn't really suffer, I think, from that is an issue. It's people missing trips when they expect to have a bus take them somewhere. That's when people choose not to use transit, maybe perhaps as consistently as they had before. So I would just encourage us to do whatever we can to get back to those levels of, mid 90% on-time performance, because that's the key to art's upward trajectory, in my opinion.
Yes.
All right. New line of questioning, Ms. Garvey.
Okay, and I will just say one comment on your thing. I absolutely agree with what you're saying about the reliability, but I think what happened is we didn't view art as exceptional. That's just the way it is. It always runs on time, of course. I mean, that was just the way it should be, and then it's, yeah. So, thank you. The one position that concerned me that I'd like to hear about was I think it's a building maintenance supervisor that you were eliminating. Is that right? And the issue is that I'm concerned about is I heard it's going to reduce responsiveness on evenings, weekends, and during emergencies when people call to complain about what's going on in a site. And that's one that really concerns me, just because when people get so upset about construction going on, and it's understandable, and it's disruptive to their lives, and if you've got some pounding going on at 5 in the morning or whatever is going on, or you think there's an emergency and stuff, you really want service right then. So that's what I'm worried about, that we won't. So please talk to me about this, about how it's going to be okay.
So I went through this pretty quickly, and I'll let John embellish, but the short story is this is for county-owned buildings and the building maintenance supervision. We have people out there on the B shift.
I was under impression it was what was going on elsewhere. Okay, that helps. Mm-hmm.
The maintenance technicians that we have and how they're supervised. And with that, I'll turn it over to John to kind of embellish on why we think we can manage that risk.
Thank you.
Right, and we just wanted to basically inform the board that there's a potential. However, we have not filled that position for 3 years, and so the staff that we have that's doing basically a hybrid B shift now, which we do with our A shift individuals, and they've been willing to work for us where they take every 2 weeks and do this B shift. And then it rotates so it doesn't impact them and their families over the year time that we've been doing it for 2 years now. So moving forward, there will be no change in supervision. It's done by the on-call shift supervisor, which is every week that rotates, and after 4 p.m., there's the on-call shift supervisor who just takes calls if necessary from these engineers that are working in the field.
No, that's fine. I misunderstood the nature of the position, and I feel much better about it now. Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Clarify for you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Gutschall.
Real quick, just to bring up the question for staff response about the food waste recycling.
So on that, there's active work underway on a proposal. It, to my mind, it hasn't been finalized yet, and the bringing that on, which I think is has always been part of our plans, requires a lot in the way of education and conversation with the community, and much more so than any of the other changes we've made. So I'm hopeful we'll be able to get there. It just wasn't quite ready yet.
Is there, so not quite ready yet, that means it's not going to happen in FY20?
I'm not proposing it in FY20, and I think that, we'll see if anything advances if I bring it off cycle. At this point, I'm not sure that that's going to happen.
Okay.
So can I follow up on that? The City of Falls Church, I think, is a little ahead of us and has implemented the service already. Have we had conversations with them and had some lessons learned that will guide us?
We actually stole one of the people from Falls Church, so yeah, we have strong relationships and we know where they're at.
All right, good. So that should maybe accelerate our getting to a point where, this can happen. The community education piece is really, from what I understand, the biggest part of it, making this successful and viable. So,
Trying to convince people how to use their kitchen counter space differently,
Yeah.
which is no small challenge.
absolutely, absolutely. All
I
right.
guess that's a little different than community education on the changes to glass recycling.
Much more difficult, yeah. Mr. DeFerranti.
So real quick, I'll be interested, you mentioned, Mr. Emanuel, a couple, as we go forward, the $1 million contingency fund, and I'm, just want to put a point in it and say, I'll be interested in a consolidation of the, yes, it's our discretion, but, the recommendations that you together are able to put forward for us as to whether additional resources are needed. I assume would come to us at some point over the next 6 to 8 weeks or later?
The short answer to that is that I've already made my recommendations as to the additional fee revenue and what I want the board to allocate at the beginning of the fiscal year. I'm going to urge the board to keep some contingency available as we go ahead and as site plans are filed. Greg's absolutely right. There'll be an impact in DES and in parks. And so I didn't feel like it was certain enough for me to do that in those areas. I thought it was a little bit more clear in planning. Now, I have received a lot of, I'd say, good-natured grief from the DES department head and the parks department head about how I prefer CPHD. That's absolutely not true. I prefer everybody. But we will be monitoring that closely.
Okay, great. So when we get there, that's great. And then the other point, I just think Ms. Garvey sort of made this, is just over the last year in conversations with the community, the importance of what DES does has become so clear. And I think it's sort of like the art system in some regards. If it works great, if what you do is awesome and excellent, then no one knows about it. And if it's not going well, then everybody hears about it. And that's just a way of all of you who are leading the department, I think, reiterating and emphasizing just how important your work to keep delivering excellence, so that few people notice what you're doing. And I'm just grateful for all the hard work that each of you are doing to try and make that happen.
In response to that, I'll just add a quick plug. Jessica, we just rolled out a new street beat or something on lining of sewer lines. Was it yesterday or the day before? So check out Dave Hundelt and others on that segment.
Thank you. So to surface another line of questioning before I know you've got, other parts of the presentation, I wanted to ask about the PACE program and see if we had any evaluative results thus far that give us any indication of what this program's potential is to helping us in the sustainability space. It looks like we're welcoming Mr. Dooley.
Mr. Pace.
Good morning. The PACE program is continuing to move along. We have a couple of projects that are in the queue. We are advancing them through the process. And so that is working together with our lenders that are part of the program, as well as the contractors. We're hopeful that within the next 2 months, we will have better news and a project that will come to close.
Great. We'll look forward to having some sort of whatever you do when a loan closes. I guess you don't cut a ribbon, but whatever you do, that'll be great. Thank you, Mr. Dooley. And one final question before we turn it back over to you, Mr. Emanuel. So the investments in paving, and I'm pleased to see the upward trajectory in our PCI performance. Just a quick question, with the level of investment that we've put in it, are we achieving the commensurate improvement in the PCI? Is there a sort of target level of investment to a PCI outcome, and are we meeting it?
Well, the art of this is working in the dynamic factors that exist. Our target PCI is 75 to 80. I stated that last year in the work session, and we just crept into that as 75.3 this year. So we're in the zone, but you got to work hard to stay in the zone, and every year is different, and you got to watch the cost of your materials because our contracts protect our contractors at some level and try to find that sweet spot on how they price things so that the price of petroleum goes up and it rolls through into the paving costs, that they're protected at some level. So the level of investment, I can never answer that once conclusively. It's going to change over time, and we will basically keep you updated in every budget and CIP cycle of where we're at.
Okay, thank you. And we'll turn it back over to you to continue with the other parts of the presentation.
All right, thank you, and we'll try to motor through this given the time. So here's a snapshot of our water and sewer systems that's supported by the Utilities Fund. Many elements to the systems. As a reminder, the Utilities Fund is an enterprise fund, meaning that water sewer rate, along with other revenues and excess fund balance, have to fully support the operations and capital needs while also maintaining the required reserves. There's a lot of maintenance and replacement of utility infrastructure in the CIP that also comes through this fund. However, I have to take a quick moment on that bottom photo to call out our all-female rapid tap-in team for the American Water Works Association competition. So rapid tap-in is a way you tap into the pipe and do it in a time manner and in a leak-proof manner. And we have the only female team in Virginia. They're going to regionals in April in Norfolk, and they're the only female team. Let's cheer them on.
And it's the International Day of the Woman. I love it.
Is it? Okay. Of course I knew that.
The screenshot looks very familiar, Mr. Emanuel.
Yes, and so we want to go from the blue screen on the top to the new customer portal in the middle photo there under the utility billing information system replacement. That's expected to go live at the end of the current fiscal year. And I must say I'm extremely proud of our team that's been toiling away on this. We're on schedule that we announced last year. We also recently awarded the contract for a water sewer cost of service and rate study, and we're getting started this month. So we're working with our contractor on the public engagement strategy right now. It'll be a 13-month project, and it will have lots of public engagement. Just as an early warning, whatever we bring to the board, you can expect some disagreement. There can't really be a win-win-win on this because we've got to keep a certain level of funding to run the operation. And so some behaviors will be incentivized, others disincentivized. There's going to be different impacts to different customer segments. Also, we're currently developing our strategic water meter plan, which will look at new technologies and inform our decisions as we plan for system replacement. And finally, we're underway with the first phase of projects in the solids master plan. We call the immediate needs from our previous briefings on this, and that replaces those processes at end of life like the bar screen building. Some of you have had an opportunity to see that. The motor control cabinet, the preliminary treatment building, things like that. Bottom line on the fund is a very modest 1.3% rate increase after holding the rate flat last year. So we'll raise just 18 cents. As I talked about earlier, we started early on this process, looking at all the funds, and we dug deep on the utility funds, looking at its own budget. If we hadn't done that strategic planning, the rate increase would have been a 4.2% increase. So we did have to fund contractual increases, investments in the workforce, the CIP, and other required increases like the software and maintenance now on our new utility billing system. So how do we do that? A combination of excess fund balance, reallocations from underutilized portions of the budget, operational efficiencies, and then finally this modest rate increase. In this budget, we are proposing 2 additional FTEs to extend the hours, enhancing customer service, and we'll talk more detail later. We did find an efficiency of $223,000 in savings, which will offset and create opportunities for other things by converting our preventive maintenance contract at the plant from contract to in-house, so we're insourcing to save $223,000. Every year, we highlight to the board the regional comparison of water sewer costs relative to a typical average residential household. So you look at us, we're the green line, kind of in the middle of the pack there, and we remain the lowest cost of jurisdictions within the Beltway with the more mature infrastructures. So we'll have an average of 828 annually for the 60,000 gallons. That's about $69 a month. Over the past 5-year period, we've had just a 4% increase overall. So we've really been doing well. You can see how those lines are converging. I'm very pleased to highlight a proposed increase in customer service and convenience, which resulted from our critical and strategic look at how we provide that service and how we want to do it better and more cost effectively. So we're going to offer several benefits with the consolidation. First, expanded call center hours, which will now be 7 to 7, used to be 8 to 5. So that'll hit before and after normal work hours for billing inquiries. And also to better serve our emergency water system calls with better customer service. The water sewer streets daytime calls, where you dial 655 for a water emergency, they'll now be transferred to the call center to be handled by a really well-trained professional customer service representative. Finally, with a shift toward an option with remote technology for our call center, we had a lot of work between Kevin Conley and DTS on that. That will be available now during high traffic periods. So if weather constitutes a snow emergency and we've also got a bunch of freezing water meters and things like that going on, we'll be able to have people remotely working to support those conditions. So we're able to, again, to provide this increased customer service without impacting the water rate directly because of that preventive maintenance contract transition at the plant, which saved us the $223,000. That basically covered it, the increased customer service. The next item is the consolidation of the electrical and instrumentation groups at the water pollution control plant, and that will result in the elimination of one field instrumentation supervisor. And while that doesn't increase, it does, increase the number of employees supervised by a single supervisor to 11. The consolidation should result in a streamlining of the operations and better coordination of the work. Overall, for the FY20 utilities budget, staff worked really hard to streamline the operations and find efficiencies. We do continue to draw down the fund balance to keep it just above the 90-day reserve. But this is kind of the last year we'll be able to do that. It was kind of the last year we could use the fund balance to achieve significant savings in the rate. We are facing double-digit inflationary cost increases for some chemicals at the plant, and some of our vendors have requested price increases. So it's kind of a current year issue as well. As I mentioned in the general fund presentation, attracting and retaining a quality workforce continues to be a challenge for us. Fortunately, the trades compensation study is being undertaken by HR, and that will also address this area of our workforce in the utilities realm. Of course, we continue appropriate funding for the adopted CIP. Okay, we can go straight into the stormwater fund if you like.
I think so.
Okay. So here's a quick overview. Like the utilities fund, it must support the operations and the capital long term. Stormwater is slightly different than the utilities fund, though. It's a special revenue fund primarily generated by tax rate levied on assessments. Our strategy, of course, is guided by the adopted Stormwater Master Plan. We're now in the 11th year of the program, and we've seen tremendous capital program demand growth in the recent years. So you look at those photos, I think this at the top is from last year, highlighting some of the capacity challenges. We had the historic rainfall of 66 inches. At the bottom picture, it's like secondary effects of the high water table. When you have a really high water table, you result in new active springs that then go downhill and go across the sidewalk. When it's cold, it freezes ice on the sidewalk. So yet another manifestation of challenges in the stormwater realm. Across the system, we are seeing continuing challenges of undercapacity, aged, and insufficient overall system. So we started talking about these challenges last fall in the stormwater work session. We don't have yet all those answers that you're looking for on the impacts of continuing redevelopment, but we're working it hard. Over time, we will likely need strategic enhancement of the system just to simply overcome the space constraints in the right-of-way, the utility complex, and fill in some of that tertiary infrastructure that doesn't exist right now. That will better position us to meet, the concerns you mentioned, Ms. Garvey, about climate, increased frequency of rains, duration of the rainfall events, things like that. And of course, the important thing is, even if the rainfall were to stay the same, we're facing an uphill battle because of the increase in impervious with redevelopment. So we have many.
Downhill battle more.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. So we have a lot of things to balance given our funding limits, and we need really cost-effective strategies to improve, rehab, replace our assets while still addressing the regulatory side and the customer impacts, which is why we're getting underway with that risk assessment that Ms. McBride already started talking about at the break. Environmental quality, though, is also a big driver of the program. It's a regulatory requirement. We're in kind of a weird space right now with the regulators. We're supposed to be in the second 5-year permit phase, yet we still don't have the permit. No. So, however, they have indicated through our insistent questioning that there will be no delay in the requirements to obtain the additional 35% reduction by 2023. So right now, we think we're on track to meet that overall 40% target by 2023. But that's going to take a substantial amount of fund balance. And then after that, we enter the third permit phase and the more aggressive remaining 60%, so that will require even more resources. Because the fund's revenue is based on the fixed tax rate with assessment growth this year, the fund's revenue and expenses increased 5% from the prior year, but there, of course, is no proposed tax rate increase this year. And we're staying steady at 44 FTEs, no change from last year. We did take 2 strategic cuts in the operating side in order to make space for more capital funding. Street sweeping frequency, and then inlet inspection and cleaning frequency. More details on that. This one is intended to free more resources for capital. It's to reduce the inspection and cleaning frequency for stormwater inlets, simply because we're finding in the field that we don't need the frequency. We're not finding problems as we're at that frequency in our field testing and results. Another reduction we're proposing is on the operations side, is a reduction in street sweeping. So the biggest change would be in the residential zones, which would reduce from 7 to 3 annual passes. And we try to time those to get the most debris. The bike lanes would also drop from 8 to 5. Mixed-use neighborhoods would continue to do their current aggressive cleaning schedule of 26 passes annually. So this reduction would not impact the permit requirements or compliance, since those are based on the commercial. So this is a new slide this year. We talked about utility rate, and so as we talk about the capital and regulatory needs for stormwater, there are some similarities to that. So we thought it appropriate to provide a regional context of rates. It's our first attempt at this slide. I'm sure it will evolve over time. But this is an attempt to go apples to apples for an annual household cost relative to most of our peers. And so you can see we're down, what we're charging is pretty low relative to most of our peers. Bottom line is we're charging like less than half of Fairfax and about 1/3 of what Falls Church is. Some jurisdictions charge a flat fee, others charge based on the tax rate. So we try to normalize this as much as we can. So looking forward, the stormwater fund is going to face many challenges. Many factors will increase signal increased funding needs. The capital needs need to address capacity. They're really highlighted in the last year's record 66 inches. We're moving systematically toward those regulatory deadlines, even without the permit. They also require capital investment. Meanwhile, our steady private redevelopment in our single-family neighborhoods will require those new solutions that may even mean more capital infrastructure. to make it work in the yards, we may have to do something in the street that doesn't exist right now. That's going to be, I think, the natural outcome of some of this multi-parcel analysis. And of course, our capital balance is depleting. So we'll look at all those things when we start the CIP process this fall, and we will bring a plan of action to the board as part of that CIP cycle. All right.
Yeah, I think keep on going. I think we are.
All right, so I'll go really quick on these. For the Boston parking garage, we financially manage the first 7 floors separately from the top 8 level. For the first 7, expenses increase significantly as the debt service payments kick in after the recent improvements with the Boston Quarter CDA bonds that were issued. The good news, floors 3 and 4 are open. We got the new technology projects done, and here's a picture of the elevator lobbies where we're looking pretty tired before the renovation and looking great now. However, on the revenue side, the Boston Quarter project was delayed, as you know, with some delay in corresponding delay in parking demand. But we are hopeful that will pick up as the retail fills in. 8th level, the numbers are so small changes, it's kind of unremarkable. The auto fund is an internal service fund. We service a total of 1,261 vehicles, which includes 177 school buses now. A lot of growth there. Each year is unique. In the auto fund, it's driven by what vehicles are due for replacement, how much they cost, what we're choosing to defer. We do have one significant, though, proposed reduction in the auto fund this year, and that's proposed reduction of 3 positions. 2 of those are vacant, and 1 is in drop, but will be out of the drop program by this time at the turnover of the fiscal year. So those positions are proposing to be cut are eliminating a machinist, a mechanic, and a trades worker. And of course, when we cut in the auto fund, the maintenance is charged back to the departments for those vehicles. So the general fund realizes some savings from those positions being eliminated. And so the outcome of this is, in some cases, some of the more complex repairs that require the specialty things will be outsourced, but we think it's a cost-effective way to go. Finally, the print fund continues to provide below-market services at above-market customer service levels. And we're showing a decrease in expenditures based on lower contractual obligations with Xerox and lower outside print shop charges for some of our things that we get from contract. That's pretty much it for all the many funds of DS. I really appreciate your support of our diverse operations and missions in a tough budget climate.
Diverse they are. So, Utilities Fund, Stormwater Fund, Boston Garage, Auto, Print. Mr. Gutschall.
On the Stormwater Management Fund, so if I'm reading correctly on Web 864, page 8, Web 864, it looks like the capital fund balance is gone from FY 18, 13, a little over 13 million to now proposed in FY 20, 7.8 million. And I'm trying to understand it. It seems like you're warning us here that there's a reckoning coming, and I just want to not beat around the bush and make sure I fully understand that. Can you elaborate a little bit?
So I think Greg has already emphasized this. To the extent that we were able to draw down fund balance, which had grown over a period of time, that lever is going to go away. And so the work session last year, the challenges that we face in stormwater and our infrastructure are considerable, and the level of funds we have here won't be able to meet some of the things that we've laid out in the board-adopted plan. So I was not so much as a reckoning, but we're going to have to figure out, and we talked about this when the CIP was adopted, other ways to provide more funding. And those could include, I'm not endorsing any of them right now, but we'll be back to you as part of the CIP, increasing the tax rate or moving to a completely different funding approach, which other jurisdictions use, where they don't use an ad valorem tax rate. They charge based on, I don't know, imperviosity. Yeah, and we use that word correctly. The amount of impervious or pervious surface. Then also looking at taking some of the balances and using that to leverage and go, use bonds to try to make the funds go further. So, I don't want to call it a reckoning, but we're going to have to do something different if we want to get more out of it.
And we're anticipating then that that would be something that we would look at with the CIP next year?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
If I could just follow up, that's a really interesting approach in terms of the perviosity, because you're creating the incentive potentially as well as the revenue source.
Yes.
They're, as you know, fraught with many policy decisions. If any of you, I was involved in this when I was at DC Water, but if you followed the recent press about cemeteries in DC and their charges, so it,
Oh, right.
you know, and that's all about because they have impervious surface type of rate. And so I just would say, yeah, it's great policy. I mean, it's really interesting, but there's a lot of data, there's a lot of policy considerations to think through. So that might be a little bit longer term kind of thing.
Ms. Garvey.
I look forward to the perviosity. I think the bog my daughter put in might start to pay off. I like this. So, as you saw, I was a little startled to hear that our MS4 permit, the second one, hadn't been approved yet. And I think we were the first in Virginia. So talk a little bit about that. I gather you don't have a whole lot of information. And then a little bit about 2023, when we're supposed to go to the next one. And the bit I've picked up is that, like, the MS4, this permit, the second one, the first one, phase one, was like kind of low-hanging fruit, not so hard. The second one, this is tougher, but we're doing pretty well. But the third one is going to be really tough, hard for us to do, and probably impossible for a lot of jurisdictions to do, I'm guessing. So are we getting, I think the whole MS4 permit process is maybe getting on a trend that can't be continued. I don't know how it's all going to kind of fall out. You probably don't either, but if you want to just make a few comments on it, because that's something looming on the horizon.
Well, to answer your first question on the next permit, it's not for lack of trying and communicating with the regulators. And of course, in any regulatory and relationship, you want to be annoying, but not too much, right? Because they're going to have negative effects.
We get it.
So I think, I think there may be staffing issues or limitations within how they're set up, and they're obviously dealing with many different permits across the Commonwealth. So we'll be patient and continue to perform toward that goal in spite of the lack of permit. We're just a little bit nervous about what other requirements they might slip in or try to negotiate with us. It's just kind of hard to tell where we're going to land until we actually get in the heat of it.
So one more issue that kind of got raised its head, and then we were reassured, no problem, as I understand, I think it's with the MS4 permits, is that we're doing a pretty good job. The state has a they're regulated, and they've got things that they're supposed to achieve, and we're helping them achieve that because we're doing a pretty darn good job. In fact, we've got a little extra space, but we help use that to meet our own requirements. There is a possibility that the state could decide, oh, you're a little extra, Arlington, you're doing great, we're going to take that for our state, and then when we need it, we don't have it because the state's already taken it. You're nodding your head, I'm not too far off. Are we hearing rumbles? Yeah, but I would just say, as soon as you hear that might be happening, please let me know, because this is a regional issue, and we'll try to work that. We do, the Chest Bay Committee that I'm on, we meet once a year with our federal and state regulators, and I can bring that up if need be. I think it's important that everybody knows it and understands it, so we can kind of nip it in the bud and not let it get too far along before people realize what's happening, if that's where we're headed. Thank you.
So, Mr. Manuel, I'd like to throw a question out there about street sweeping. So it's my understanding that it's historically been one of the more cost-effective ways to keep contaminants out of waterways. And recognizing that our permit doesn't require us to do residential, it seems that the same principle should apply, that you'd want to keep contaminants out of waterways regardless of whether or not they assist with permit compliance. So my question is, with your focus on business intelligence, instead of the blunt instrument of cutting residential service, period, are we thinking about looking at delivering the street sweeping according to the needs of particular residential neighborhoods. They're not all created equal. Some may very well, can use 2 or 3 passes a year. Maybe some need 4 or 5. Have we thought about marrying the whole idea of not just the blunt instrument, but trying to actually meet the needs and being effective but in keeping the contamination away? I would think particularly that edge residential neighborhoods are probably going to be a little bit higher level of street debris than some others. And I just feel like we might be missing an opportunity to actually do the most environmental good.
I think that's a great point, and I think that with a lower, committed frequency on street sweeping, that also might create a little more flexibility for us to be responsive to where those needs are, and whether they're called or observed. So that's a great point, and we'll see if we can dig in a little bit more on that, because it's all about getting the tonnage.
Yeah.
The challenge that we found in the residential neighborhoods is, despite our absolute best efforts at communicating and telling people when to move their cars and what day to not be on the street and all that, the compliance just isn't there. And so we have a lot of, I've seen it in my own neighborhoods, where if there's a little bit of moisture, you see the path of where the sweeper went around that car, the sweeper went around that car, and it's like the sweeper's just in the middle of the street where there's no debris. So that kind of, so we had a lot of that experience, and that kind of drove our decision, is that it's like, we want to do what is productive, which is exactly what you're saying.
Right.
How do we get to what is productive? And in many cases, we weren't being productive on many of those lane miles we were driving.
That's an interesting dimension. I know other municipalities kind of solve that problem by being very aggressive with ticketing.
Yeah.
At the same time, you sort of run that risk of people not viewing your efforts at decontaminating the environment just as a money grab. So that's complex. Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Nevertheless, a way to raise resources for more street sweeping.
Right. You said that. Oh, smart. There we go.
Can I follow up with a little,
Please,
sort of, we're all sort of laughing.
Sure.
So my daughter has this wonderful little machine now. It's a little robot. She pushes a button, and when she's gone, it just kind of goes around and sweeps up. Is there some look to do? It just occurred to me, on streets, is there some way you get little?
Industrial Roombas.
Yes, yeah. It's called a D-Bot, this one. It works pretty cool. Maybe, I bet that might do this, so then that car moves in and the little robot moves in and sweeps it out when the car finally moves. So anyway, just a thought. I don't know if we're looking at it but.
I think, just like Mr. Leach mentioned, the kind of the revolution in transportation and responding to it, I think that we will see opportunities over time in the public workspace for different technologies, whether manned or unmanned, robotic, or whatever. I'm hopeful of a lot of things: better data collection, better service, better, you name it.
Right. It's sort of a little off the, off the reservation idea, but actually it's working really well, so it'd be cool. Thanks.
All right. Any other questions for Mr. Manuel? Seeing none. It means you must have done an excellent job in predicting all of our questions and answering them in your presentation. We very much appreciate your doing yeoman's work, and everyone in the DES team, thank you for joining us on this Friday, and happy International Women's Day.
Exactly. Thank you.